I thought I knew what betrayal looked like until I stood at an altar and pressed play on 15 photographs that shattered 300 guests' idea of my perfect fiancé. Derek Hamilton went to bed early every single night for 6 months, texting me sweet goodnights while his lips were still warm from kissing another woman. My fiancé went to bed early every night, until the wedding screen revealed his secret, and I learned that some men don't cheat in the dark. They cheat in plain sight, counting on your love to keep you blind. But I had someone watching when I couldn't see. Subscribe to witness how a good night text became his public execution. I built my life the way I designed buildings, with precision, intention, and an unshakable belief that if you measured everything correctly, nothing could collapse. At 27, I had the career, the downtown loft with exposed brick, the walk-in closet full of tailored blazers that made clients take me seriously despite my age. I had Derek Hamilton, 32, impossibly handsome, who owned 3 artisanal coffee shops across the city and knew exactly how to make me feel like the only woman who'd ever mattered. He proposed on a rooftop garden he'd rented for the evening, string lights tangled in olive trees, my favorite Norah Jones song playing from hidden speakers, and when he opened that velvet box, I saw my future crystallize into something so perfect it almost hurt to look at directly. Our relationship had a rhythm I trusted completely, the kind of comfortable pattern that made me feel safe in a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. Derek worked long hours managing his growing coffee empire, and I understood that success required sacrifice. I made those sacrifices too, spending evenings alone reviewing blueprints while he handled inventory and staffing crises. 3 or 4 nights a week, around 9:30, my phone would light up with the same message variations. Exhausted babe, heading to bed early, love you, or so tired, can barely keep my eyes open, sweet dreams beautiful. And I'd smile at his texts, picturing him collapsing into bed after another grueling day of building the life we'd share together after the wedding. I never questioned the pattern because questioning felt like doubting, and I'd learned from my parents' bitter divorce that doubt was the virus that killed relationships from the inside out. My mother had interrogated my father about every late meeting, every unexplained receipt, every moment he wasn't exactly where she expected him to be, and their marriage had disintegrated into accusations and resentment before I turned 13. I'd promised myself I'd never become that woman, the suspicious wife who turned love into an investigation, who measured affection in phone records and GPS coordinates. So when Derek said he was tired, I believed him, because belief was what separated healthy love from toxic paranoia, or so I'd convinced myself during all those nights I fell asleep alone. The wedding planning consumed me in the best possible way, giving me a project that combined my design skills with the intoxicating fantasy of creating one perfect day that would mark the beginning of forever. I spent hours selecting the exact shade of ivory for the tablecloths, the precise angle of light through the cathedral windows, the specific moment when the string quartet would transition from Pachelbel to an original composition I'd commissioned. Derek seemed less invested in the details, waving away questions about floral arrangements and seating charts with the same exhausted smile. Whatever makes you happy, babe. You're the architect of this day. But I interpreted his detachment as masculine practicality rather than what it actually was, which was the indifference of a man who knew the whole production was a lie he'd have to maintain for exactly one afternoon. 3 weeks before the wedding, I stopped at Café Parallax on 5th Street, a place I rarely visited because it wasn't on my usual route between the office and home, needing an emergency caffeine infusion after a client meeting ran 3 hours over schedule. The barista had just handed me my oat milk latte when I heard a voice I hadn't heard in 8 years, a voice that instantly transported me back to summer nights catching fireflies in mason jars and winter afternoons building snow forts that we'd defend against imaginary armies. Jake Morrison stood near the pastry case, broader-shouldered and harder-faced than the gangly 19-year-old who'd enlisted the day after graduation, but his eyes held the same warmth that had made him my favorite person in the world until the Army had claimed him, and distance had eroded our friendship into occasional birthday texts and Christmas cards. We talked for 2 hours in that cafe, time dissolving the way it does when you're reconnecting with someone who knew you before you became the person you pretend to be for the world. Jake had just returned from his final deployment, finally civilian after 8 years of service he described in careful, measured words that suggested he'd seen things he'd never fully share. I told him about my architecture firm, about Derek, about the wedding in 3 weeks, and when I invited him, "You have to come, Jake. You're like a brother to me." Something flickered across his face that I was too excited to properly decode, a shadow of emotion that should have warned me that some truths were already gathering, like storm clouds just beyond my carefully designed horizon. Subscribe to discover what happens when the brother you forgot was watching, becomes the only one who sees the truth you're too in love to notice. Jake showed up at my door 4 days after our cafe reunion, looking like he hadn't slept since I'd seen him last, his jaw tight with an expression I'd never seen him wear even during the worst of our childhood misadventures. He asked if we could talk privately, and something in his voice made my stomach drop even before he started speaking. That instinctive animal sense that recognizes when someone is about to detonate your reality with information you can't unknow. I led him to my living room, the same space where Derek had practiced his vows just 2 nights earlier, and Jake sat on the edge of my cream-colored sofa like he was afraid his words might stain the furniture permanently if he settled in too comfortably. What he said next felt like someone had rewritten the laws of physics while I was standing still. He'd seen Derek 2 nights ago at the Crimson Lounge, a upscale bar in the financial district, with a woman who definitely wasn't me, and they weren't having a business meeting unless business now included hands tangled in hair and mouths fused together like they were trying to breathe each other's air. Jake described the woman, red hair, emerald dress, laughing at something Derek whispered against her neck, and I felt reality fracture into 2 competing versions. The one where my fiancé was faithful and exhausted, and this new impossible one where Jake, my childhood friend who'd been gone for 8 years, was somehow manufacturing lies about the man I was supposed to marry in 17 days. I didn't choose to believe Derek. My belief was automatic, a reflex that bypassed conscious thought entirely because the alternative was too architecturally unsound to support the weight of my entire future. I told Jake he was mistaken, that he must have seen someone who looked like Derek, that maybe deployment had damaged his perception or judgment in ways he hadn't yet processed with proper therapy. The words coming out of my mouth sounded reasonable and calm, but underneath them was a volcanic rage I barely recognized, fury at Jake for trying to sabotage my happiness with his confused observations, anger at myself for inviting him into this sacred pre-wedding space, only to have him contaminate it with paranoid accusations. When he tried to protest, to insist he was certain, I pointed at my door and told him to leave, my voice sharp enough to cut through whatever delusion he was experiencing. He left without another word, but the look he gave me before he walked out contained something that haunted me for the next 48 hours. Not anger at my rejection, but a devastating sadness like he was watching me walk toward a cliff edge and knew that anything he said would only make me run faster toward the drop. I spent that night in Derek's arms, seeking reassurance in his solid presence, the familiar scent of his cologne, the way he stroked my hair and murmured that some people couldn't stand to see others happy, that Jake probably had unresolved feelings and was acting out of jealousy. Derek's explanation made perfect sense, fit seamlessly into the narrative I needed to believe, and I let myself sink into the comfort of his lies because the truth would have required me to demolish everything I'd built and start over from bare ground. 2 days later, at 7 in the morning on a Saturday when I was still in my pajamas reviewing final seating arrangements, my doorbell rang with an urgency that suggested emergency or disaster. Jake stood there again, but this time he wasn't asking for permission or hoping I'd believe his words. He was holding a manila envelope, the kind that prosecutors use in crime dramas to present evidence that can't be argued away with explanations or alternative theories. He handed it to me without speaking, and when I opened it, 15 photographs spilled across my breakfast bar like a deck of cards revealing a hand that had been rigged against me from the start, each image a separate gut punch that collectively demolished the architecture of everything I'd believed about my life. Derek and the redhead, kissing outside a hotel on March 15th, a night he'd texted me at 9:45 saying he was too exhausted to come over, needed to crash early. Derek and the redhead, his hand on her lower back as they entered a restaurant on April 2nd, a night he'd said he was doing inventory at the West Side location until midnight. Derek and the redhead, her head on his shoulder in his car on May 7th, the night before he'd taken me to brunch and told me how lucky he felt to have found someone as trusting and understanding as me. 15 photographs spanning 6 months, each one time-stamped and geotagged, each one corresponding exactly to a night he'd claimed exhaustion, each one proving that my fiancé hadn't been going to bed early at all, but had been saving his energy for a completely different relationship that existed in the spaces between his lies to me. Subscribe to witness what happens when the man who was supposed to protect your heart becomes the one who methodically destroys it while saying goodnight. I couldn't breathe properly for what felt like hours, my lungs forgetting their basic function as I spread the photographs across every surface of my kitchen island, arranging them chronologically like a timeline of my own stupidity. Jake stood silent in my doorway, not approaching, not offering comfort, just bearing witness to the moment when I had to reconstruct my entire reality around this new, unbearable information that rewrote every sweet text message, every tired excuse, Every night, I'd fallen asleep alone, thinking my fiancé was doing the same thing 3 miles away, when he was actually tangled up with someone whose name I didn't even know yet. The morning light coming through my windows felt obscene, too bright and cheerful for a moment when I was learning that the man who'd proposed under string lights and olive trees was the same man who'd been conducting a parallel life with such skill that I'd never suspected anything beyond ordinary exhaustion. When I could finally form words, I asked Jake how he'd gotten these photographs, and his answer made something in my chest crack open in a completely different way than the betrayal had. He'd hired a private investigator the day after I threw him out of my apartment, not because he was trying to be right or win some argument, but because he couldn't stand the thought of me walking into a marriage that was built on systematic deception. He'd spent 8 years in combat zones learning to identify threats and neutralize them before they could cause casualties, and every instinct he'd developed told him that Derek Hamilton was a threat to someone Jake had loved since we were kids racing bikes down Cemetery Hill. The private investigator had followed Derek for 6 days and produced 15 photographs that told a story more coherent than any vows Derek had written in his leather-bound notebook. Jake explained all of this in that calm, measured, military voice, and I realized he wasn't angry with me for doubting him, wasn't seeking vindication or apology. He was simply doing what he'd apparently always done, which was watch over me even when I didn't know I needed watching, even when I'd pushed him away and accused him of jealousy and delusion. He told me he'd discovered something else, too. Something the investigator had uncovered that made the betrayal even more architecturally complex. The redhead's name was Sarah Bennett, and she wasn't the only secret Derek was keeping. But Jake wanted to wait to share that information until I'd processed this first layer of devastation because human beings could only absorb so much truth at once, before their psychological structure started to fail completely under the weight. I asked Jake why he'd come back after I'd rejected his warning so viciously, why he'd spent money and time proving something I'd refused to believe, and his answer broke something in me that had been holding itself together through sheer force of will and wedding planning momentum. He said, "Because I've loved you since we were 14 years old, Emma, and I couldn't watch you marry someone who doesn't deserve to breathe the same air you breathe, let alone promise you forever while he's actively creating forevers with other people." The confession hung in my kitchen like smoke after a fire, and I couldn't process it immediately because my emotional capacity was already overloaded with images of Derek's mouth on someone else's neck. But somewhere deep in my devastation, I registered that someone had been loving me faithfully for 13 years, while I'd been planning a wedding to a man who'd been lying to me for 6 months minimum. I sat on my kitchen floor because standing felt impossible, and Jake sat next to me, not touching, just present in the way soldiers are present in foxholes, offering solidarity rather than solutions because he understood that some situations don't have solutions, only decisions about what to do with the wreckage. We sat there for 2 hours while I cycled through rage and humiliation and a horrible clarity about all the nights I'd convinced myself his exhaustion was evidence of his dedication when it was actually evidence of his duplicity. Every "good night beautiful" had been sent from hotel parking lots or restaurant bathrooms or her apartment. Every "so tired" had meant tired from performing a completely different relationship that requires the same energy you think is reserved for building our future. Together. Finally, when the shock started converting into something more focused and operational, I looked at Jake and asked him what I should do, and he said something I'll never forget. "You should do whatever makes you feel like yourself again, because right now you're looking at me like you don't know who you are anymore. And that's what he took from you, Emma. Not just your trust, but your sense of your own judgment and reality." Then he added, almost as an afterthought, but with an intensity that made me understand he'd been thinking about this possibility, "But if you want to make sure everyone knows exactly who Derek Hamilton really is before he gets the chance to rewrite this story and make you look crazy for calling off a wedding, I know some people who can help with that." Subscribe to discover how a woman architect designs the blueprint for perfect public revenge when her fiancé's carefully constructed lies are about to collapse in front of 300 witnesses. I didn't cancel the wedding. That would have been mercy, and Derek Hamilton had exhausted his mercy allotment the moment he sent his first "good night, babe" text from another woman's bed. So instead, I activated every strategic skill I'd developed, designing buildings that had to withstand earthquakes and hurricanes, and decided to engineer a collapse so spectacular that everyone who witnessed it would remember exactly what happens when you build a relationship on foundations made of systematic lies. Jake introduced me to Marcus Chen, a wedding videographer who specialized in creating those emotional montage presentations that play during receptions, the kind that make grandmothers cry into their champagne. Except Marcus had another specialty that wasn't advertised on his website, which was creating presentations designed to detonate marriages before they could legally begin. and he'd apparently helped 3 other women expose cheating fiancés with perfectly timed visual evidence that couldn't be explained away or minimized. Marcus came to my apartment the next evening with his laptop and a professional calm that suggested he'd seen this particular devastation before and understood that my composure wasn't coldness, but rather the focused precision of someone who'd converted grief into tactical planning. We spent 4 hours selecting which photographs would have maximum impact. Not all 15, because too many images would give Derek time to recover or flee, but rather a carefully curated sequence of 7 that told a complete story with timestamps and locations visible in the corners, impossible to dismiss as misunderstandings or coincidences. Marcus suggested we add one additional element that would transform the presentation from simple exposure to comprehensive destruction: text messages between Derek and Sarah that the private investigator had obtained through methods I decided not to inquire about too closely. Messages where Derek called me clingy and exhausting, and said he couldn't wait until after the wedding when he could finally relax and stop performing this devoted fiancé bullshit. The plan crystallized with such elegant simplicity that I felt that same satisfaction I experienced when a complex architectural problem suddenly revealed its perfect solution. I would go through with the entire wedding ceremony exactly as planned, right up until the moment when Father Michael asked if anyone present knew of any reason why Derek and I should not be joined in holy matrimony. That's when I'd raise my hand, my white dress still pristine, my makeup still flawless, and activate the presentation on the massive screen we'd rented for the reception slideshow. Except the reception would never happen because the ceremony would end with Derek's character executed in front of every person whose opinion he valued: his conservative family, his business partners, his country club friends who believed his carefully maintained image of the successful entrepreneur who'd found his perfect architect bride. Jake had one additional piece of information to share: the secondary revelation he'd warned me about in my kitchen. And when he finally told me, I understood that Derek's betrayal operated on levels I hadn't imagined possible, even after seeing the photographs that proved his affair. Sarah Bennett wasn't his only secret. Derek was already married, had been married for 5 years to Patricia Hamilton, a pharmaceutical sales representative who traveled extensively for work, and apparently had no idea her husband was operating an entirely separate life complete with a fiancé planning a wedding, while his legal wife thought he was managing coffee shops and attending business conferences. Jake had the marriage certificate, public record from a courthouse wedding in 2020, and suddenly Derek's reluctance to discuss wedding details made perfect sense. He wasn't planning our future. He was choreographing the maintenance of multiple presents that couldn't coexist if anyone discovered the truth. I asked Jake how he'd found Patricia, and he explained that the private investigator had run a basic background check that revealed the existing marriage. And then Jake had done something extraordinary. He'd contacted Patricia directly, explained the situation with evidence, and invited her to attend the wedding as a guest, telling her only that she needed to be there to witness something that concerned her directly. Patricia had agreed, apparently intrigued enough by Jake's military credentials and detailed information to trust that whatever was happening, it wasn't a scam or a prank, but rather something that would answer questions she'd been asking herself about Derek's increasingly frequent absences and his habit of turning off his phone during what he claimed were intensive business strategy sessions. Jake had given Patricia a seat in the 3rd row, close enough to see everything clearly, but not so close that Derek would notice her before the presentation began. The week before the wedding, I performed the role of blissfully ignorant bride with such commitment that I should have won awards for the acting. I confirmed final details with the caterer, sent Derek sweet texts thanking him for being my forever, posted Instagram stories showing my dress hanging in the closet with captions about counting down to the best day of my life. Derek seemed relieved by my apparent normalcy, probably thinking that whatever suspicions Jake had tried to plant had died from lack of evidence or belief, and he resumed his pattern of early bedtime texts with renewed confidence, not knowing that each message was being screenshot and added to a folder labeled "Evidence of Systematic Deception" that I reviewed every night to fuel the rage that was keeping me functional through this performance. Subscribe to witness the moment when 300 wedding guests discover that the charming groom they're celebrating is actually a man who turned marriage into a competitive sport where everyone loses except him. The morning of my wedding day, I woke up feeling more clear-headed and purposeful than I had on any morning in the previous 3 weeks. That crystalline focus that comes when you've stopped pretending and started executing a plan that will permanently alter the trajectory of multiple lives, including your own. My bridesmaids arrived at 8 to begin hair and makeup, chattering excitedly about how perfect everything looked, how lucky I was, how Derek absolutely worshipped me, and I smiled and nodded and let them paint my face into bridal perfection, while internally I was running through the timeline Marcus and I had choreographed down to the minute, visualizing each moment like I visualized building presentations before client meetings, seeing the whole structure before the first stone was laid. The cathedral looked exactly as I'd designed it, afternoon light streaming through stained glass windows creating patterns of colored illumination across white pews, 300 guests in their formal attire whispering and taking photos, the massive projection screen positioned perfectly behind the altar where everyone could see it clearly, but where it looked natural enough that no one questioned why we'd need such technology during a traditional Catholic ceremony. Derek stood at the altar in his custom Italian suit, looking appropriately nervous, probably thinking his nervousness was normal groom anxiety, rather than the subconscious recognition that a man living multiple lives might eventually face consequences for the psychological architecture he'd constructed so carefully. Jake sat in the front row on my side, wearing his dress military uniform at my request, looking like exactly what he was. A soldier prepared to execute a mission that required precision timing and unwavering commitment to the objective. The processional began with my bridesmaids walking down the aisle in their dusty rose dresses, then the flower girl scattering petals, then finally the moment when everyone stood and turned to watch me appear in the doorway, backlit by late afternoon sun, looking every inch the radiant bride whose happiness was about to justify all the expense and travel and time these 300 people had invested in celebrating this union. I walked down that aisle with my head high and my bouquet steady, making eye contact with Derek, who looked at me with what appeared to be genuine love and relief. And I realized that he'd probably convinced himself his lies were somehow protective, that what I didn't know couldn't hurt me, that his betrayal was actually a form of devotion, because he was keeping his complicated life away from our simple, perfect romance. Father Michael began the ceremony with traditional words about the sanctity of marriage, the commitment required, the honesty that must exist between two people joining their lives before God and community, and every word felt like a hammer striking an anvil, forging meaning Derek had already corrupted beyond recognition. We moved through the liturgy, the readings, the homily, the exchange of intentions, and I responded with perfect composure because this was still my ceremony, my performance, my moment to demonstrate that I could execute a complex plan under extreme pressure while maintaining the appearance of conventional bridal emotion. Derek's hands were sweating when we held them during the vows, his voice slightly unsteady, and I wondered if some part of him sensed that this moment was going to end differently than he'd rehearsed. Then Father Michael reached the critical moment, his voice resonating through the cathedral with ceremonial gravity. If any person present knows of any reason why Derek and Emma should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace. The traditional pause followed, that moment that's usually pure formality, a dramatic beat before the ceremony continues toward its inevitable conclusion. Except I raised my left hand, the one that should have been receiving Derek's ring in approximately 90 seconds, and said in a voice that carried perfectly to every corner of that sacred space, "I do, Father Michael. I have a reason, and I think everyone here deserves to see exactly why this marriage cannot proceed." The cathedral went absolutely silent. That particular quality of shocked quiet that happens when 300 people simultaneously stop breathing because reality has just departed from the script they were all following, and Derek's face transformed through a sequence of expressions that would have been comical if they weren't confirming every terrible thing I now knew about his character. Confusion, then recognition, then panic, then a desperate attempt to reassert control by reaching for my hand and whispering, "Emma, what are you doing? This isn't funny. Everyone's watching." I stepped back from his touch and nodded at Marcus, who was positioned at the sound booth, and the projection screen behind us illuminated with the first photograph, Derek and the redhead kissing outside the Meridian Hotel. Timestamp reading March 15th, 9:47 p.m. The same night he'd texted me, "Exhausted babe, heading to bed early. Love you endlessly." Subscribe to discover what happens when a cheating fiancé's worst nightmare plays out in high definition while his mother screams and his secret wife stands up from the third row. The second photograph appeared before Derek could process the first, him and Sarah entering Ristorante Lucia on April 2nd, his hand possessively on her lower back. Timestamp 8:15 p.m. A night he'd told me he was doing inventory at the Westside location and couldn't meet me for our planned dinner because he was buried in spreadsheets and coffee bean orders. The cathedral erupted into chaos with that second image, gasps and whispers multiplying into a collective sound like a hive of bees suddenly aware of an intruder, and Derek lunged toward the sound booth trying to stop the presentation, but Jake was already moving, intercepting him with the calm efficiency of someone trained to neutralize threats, physically blocking Derek's path while maintaining enough professional distance that it looked like helpful crowd control rather than aggressive intervention. The third photograph showed Derek and Sarah in his BMW, her head on his shoulder, his lips against her hair, timestamp May 7th, 10:23 p.m. And I watched Derek's mother stand up from her front row seat, her hand over her mouth, her face transforming from confusion to horror as she recognized her son's car, her son's profile, her son's betrayal projected 15 feet high, where her entire social circle could witness the destruction of the reputation she'd spent 32 years helping him cultivate. Derek's father remained seated, but his face had gone dangerously red. That particular shade that suggests cardiovascular crisis or volcanic rage, and I felt a momentary flicker of concern before remembering that these people had raised a man who thought marriage vows were negotiable and honesty was optional, so perhaps they bore some responsibility for the disaster currently unfolding in their family cathedral. The fourth photograph was the one that broke something fundamental in the crowd's collective psychology. Derek and Sarah entering a hotel room, his hand sliding under her coat, her face turned up toward his with an expression of anticipation that made it impossible to claim this was innocent friendship or misunderstood business relationship. Timestamp June 3rd, 11:47 p.m. A night that corresponded exactly with Derek's calendar notation for emergency meeting with Seattle distributor. Might not be able to call tonight. The whispers became full-voiced conversations, people pulling out phones to photograph the photographs, to text friends who weren't present, to document this spectacular implosion that would fuel gossip for years across every social network these 300 witnesses inhabited. And I realized that Derek's reputation wasn't just being damaged, it was being completely destroyed in real time with photographic evidence that couldn't be disputed or explained. Away. The presentation shifted then to the text message screenshots, blown up large enough that everyone could read Derek's actual words about me. Emma is so exhausting with all her wedding planning obsession. I swear if I have to discuss flower arrangements one more time, I'm going to lose my mind. Sent to Sarah on March 20th. The same day he'd told me how much he loved watching me get excited about creating our perfect day. Another message. Just sent her the goodnight text. She always buys it. Thinks I'm passed out when really I'm just getting started with you, babe. Sent April 15th with a winky face emoji that made my stomach turn even though I'd already seen it a dozen times during preparation. A third message. Can't wait until after the wedding when I can finally relax and stop performing this devoted fiancé bullshit. Maintaining 2 relationships is fucking exhausting. Sent May Sound, confirming that every tender moment, every romantic gesture, every expression of love had been performance art. He couldn't wait to stop performing. Then came the revelation I'd saved for maximum impact. The screen displayed a marriage certificate, official seal visible, showing Derek Allen Hamilton married to Patricia Ann Hamilton on August 14, 2020, witnessed and legally binding, proving that our entire relationship had been fraud from the beginning, because he'd proposed to me while already legally married to someone else, which meant the ceremony wasn't just being stopped by a betrayed fiancé, but was actually being prevented from becoming accidental bigamy that could have carried criminal consequences. I turned to face the congregation and said into the microphone Father Michael had been using, my voice steady despite my heart attempting to escape my chest through pure kinetic force. Derek has been married for 5 years to Patricia Hamilton, who is sitting in the 3rd row, who had no idea her husband was attempting to marry someone else today. Every head in the cathedral swiveled to locate Patricia, who stood up with remarkable composure considering her entire world had just been revealed as elaborate fiction, her elegant cream suit and perfectly styled dark hair making her look like she'd dressed for a confrontation rather than a wedding, though perhaps Jake had warned her that today would require armor rather than celebration. Patricia walked down the aisle toward the altar with the measured pace of someone who'd spent the last week preparing for this exact moment, and when she reached Derek, who'd gone completely pale and appeared to be dissociating from reality as a survival mechanism, she said loud enough for the front rows to hear clearly, 5 years, Derek, 5 years of marriage while you were building a completely separate life with her, and probably others before her, and I stayed quiet because the investigator your friend hired asked me to wait until today, until everyone you care about could see exactly who you really are. Subscribe to witness the final act of perfect revenge, when the other woman discovers she's been betrayed too, and the groom's entire world collapses in front of the people whose respect he valued most. Derek attempted damage control with the desperate improvisation of a man watching his entire existence disintegrate in real time, trying to grab the microphone to offer explanations or apologies or whatever words might possibly reduce the magnitude of his public execution, but Jake intercepted him again, this time less gently, escorting Derek toward the cathedral's side exit while Derek's father finally stood up and followed. their family's humiliation now complete and requiring privacy to process what came next. The redhead, Sarah Bennett, remained frozen in her seat near the back, her emerald dress suddenly looking less sophisticated and more like costume jewelry, her face cycling through confusion and betrayal as she realized she'd been as deceived as I was, that Derek had sold her a fantasy of being his serious girlfriend while failing to mention both his wife and his fiancé. The architectural complexity of his deceptions, apparently requiring 3 separate women who never compared notes. I stood at that altar in my wedding dress, feeling something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but also wasn't grief. It was more like the emotional equivalent of a forest fire that clears dead growth to make space for new life, destructive but necessary, painful but ultimately purifying. Father Michael approached me with genuine pastoral concern, asking quietly if I needed anything, if I wanted him to clear the cathedral so I could have privacy, but I shook my head because privacy would come later. Right now, I needed to address these 300 witnesses who'd come expecting celebration and instead received documentary evidence of betrayal operating on multiple levels simultaneously. I took the microphone and said, "Thank you all for being here today to witness what happens when someone builds a relationship on systematic lies. And special thanks to Jake Morrison, my oldest friend who loved me enough to tell me a truth I didn't want to hear, and then prove that truth with evidence I couldn't deny." Jake walked back down the aisle toward me, his uniform catching light from the stained glass windows. And when he reached the altar, he didn't say anything dramatic or try to create a romantic movie moment. He just stood next to me the way he'd been standing next to me metaphorically for weeks, solid and present and completely honest in a world that had felt increasingly constructed from Derek's carefully maintained fictions. Patricia approached us both and did something unexpected. She hugged me, this stranger who'd unknowingly been planning to marry her legal husband, and whispered, "I'm filing for divorce on Monday and taking half of everything he owns, including those coffee shops he's so proud of, and I hope you find someone who deserves the careful way you plan beautiful things." Then she walked out of the cathedral with her head high, already transformed from victim into survivor, her expensive heels clicking against marble floors like punctuation marks ending a chapter she'd probably been wanting to close for years. The aftermath played out across social media with viral velocity that exceeded anything I could have engineered intentionally. Guests posted photos of the projection screen showing Derek's betrayal. Video clips of Patricia's moment of confrontation circulated with hashtags like "I'm wedding revenge" and "Pon Cotton the altar screen." And by evening, Derek Hamilton's carefully cultivated reputation had been replaced with infamy as the man who'd tried to marry his second wife while still married to his first, while simultaneously maintaining a girlfriend who thought she was his only serious relationship. His coffee shop started losing business immediately as customers decided they didn't want to support someone whose personal ethics suggested serious character deficiencies. His conservative family publicly distanced themselves through a statement saying they were shocked and appalled by revelations that contradict everything they'd believed about their son, and Sarah Bennett posted a tearful TikTok explaining she'd been completely deceived and had no idea Derek was married or engaged, which at least saved her from being cast as a knowing homewrecker. I canceled the honeymoon we'd planned to Hawaii and used that money instead to book 2 tickets to Europe, one for me, one for Jake, framing it initially as a friendship trip, a recovery journey, a chance to process trauma in beautiful places far from the wreckage of my almost wedding that had become Diego's complete destruction. We spent 2 weeks moving through Paris and Rome and Barcelona, and somewhere during those 14 days of museums and cafes and conversations that lasted until sunrise, I started seeing Jake differently. Not as the brother figure I'd conveniently categorized him as to avoid complicated feelings, but as the man who'd loved me faithfully for 13 years without asking for anything in return, who'd risked our friendship to tell me a truth that saved me from legal entanglement with a fraud, who'd never once said, "I told you so," but instead had just been present while I processed the devastation of discovering my judgment had been so catastrophically compromised. On our last night in Paris, standing on a bridge over the Seine with city lights reflecting off dark water, Jake said something that shifted my entire understanding of what love could be when it was real, rather than performed. "I know you're not ready for anything beyond friendship right now, Emma, and that's completely fine. I'm not telling you how I feel because I expect anything in exchange. I just want you to know that real love doesn't require you to ignore your instincts or doubt your perceptions or accept exhaustion as affection." 6 months later, after I'd processed Derek's betrayal through therapy and time, and the reconstruction of my ability to trust my own judgment, Jake and I got married on a beach in Hawaii during sunset. Just 12 people present. No projection screens or dramatic revelations necessary. Just 2 people who'd known each other since childhood, finally admitting that friendship had been incubating something deeper all along, waiting for me to be ready to recognize that the person who shows up when your world collapses is often the person who should have been there all along. And the man who texts goodnight from someone else's bed was never worthy of the woman who believed his lies because she'd been taught that trust was virtue, rather than understanding that trust should be earned through consistency, rather than granted automatically through ignorance pretending to be faith.